It is the autumn of 1942, and a young woman named Noor Inayat Khan is standing on a rain-slicked pavement in occupied Paris. She carries with her a leather handbag, a forged identity card, and a radio transmitter concealed inside a suitcase. She is one of the Special Operations Executive's most daring agents, and she is being watched. German Sicherheitsdienst officers have been trailing SOE operatives across France for months, methodically dismantling networks, arresting couriers, and extracting information in the cellars of the Avenue Foch. They are very good at what they do. They search everything: coats, shoes, books, hollow-heeled walking sticks, the linings of suitcases, the spines of novels. They are thorough, methodical, and ruthless. But there is something they are not finding. Something so absurdly, impossibly small that it defies their most systematic searches. A piece of intelligence. A complete, detailed, typewritten page, compressed to a size no larger than a full stop at the end of this sentence. It is called a microdot, and it is arguably the most elegant espionage technology of the entire Second World War. Not a code, not a cipher, not a hollow coin, or a concealed radio. Those, the Germans eventually found. The microdot is something altogether more audacious, a full-scale intelligence document, shrunk to near invisibility and hidden not in a secret compartment, but in plain sight, tucked beneath a postage stamp, affixed to the surface of a printed letter as an ordinary-looking full stop, glued inside the punctuation of a postcard, staring at you, utterly invisible, unless you know precisely where to look and precisely how to look. This is the story of how British intelligence, working in close collaboration with émigré scientists and the clandestine laboratories of wartime London, perfected a technology so fiendishly clever that even the vaunted German Abwehr, the military intelligence service that cracked networks, broke codes, and turned agents with ruthless efficiency, could not reliably detect it. It is a story of optics, chemistry, patience, and one of the most important assays, memetries of the entire intelligence war. The difference between an enemy who searches everything and an adversary who hides in nothing at all. To understand why the microdot mattered so profoundly, you must first understand the terrible problem that faced British intelligence in the years immediately following Dunkirk. By the summer of 1940, continental Europe was sealed. The networks that MI6 had painstakingly built across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond were shattered or compromised. The men and women who remained behind enemy lines, those willing to resist, to gather information, to pass on the movements of German armored divisions and the locations of V-weapon sites, had almost no reliable way to communicate with London. Radio was the obvious solution, and the SOE and MI6 both invested heavily in miniaturized wireless sets. But radio transmission was a death sentence measured in weeks. German direction-finding vans, the so-called Funkabwehr, roamed occupied cities triangulating signals. A radio operator who transmitted for more than 20 minutes from the same location was almost certainly identified. The rule of thumb in the field was brutally simple. Keep moving, keep transmissions short, and do not, under any circumstances, use the same location twice. Even so, agents were caught. Networks fell. Written communications offered an alternative, but one fraught with its own hideous risks. A letter crossing an international frontier, even via neutral Switzerland, Spain, or Portugal, passed through multiple checkpoints. German censors opened, read, and resealed correspondence with extraordinary diligence. They tested papers for invisible inks. They examined envelopes under ultraviolet light. They developed techniques for detecting chemical alterations to seemingly innocent text. Invisible ink, once the great standby of the spy trade, had become so well understood by German counterintelligence that it was practically useless for anything beyond the most rudimentary field communication. The result was a crisis of information. Agents in the field were gathering intelligence, order of battle information, industrial targets, coastal fortifications, the disposition of panzer divisions. That was simply irretrievable. The volume of information that needed to travel in a single courier's pocket far exceeded what could be memorized or encoded in a short radio burst. An agent might learn the precise locations of 40 anti-aircraft batteries along the Channel coast, the shift rotation of a garrison, the output figures of a synthetic oil plant. Memorizing such detail was impossible. Carrying it written in plain text was suicidal. Encoding it produced a message so lengthy that transmission would take hours. Something else was needed.
Something that could compress an entire page of typewritten intelligence to a size that was, for all practical purposes, invisible. The solution emerged not from a single brilliant insight, but from the convergence of two streams of pre-war knowledge. The first was the science of microphotography, which had existed in rudimentary form since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when besieged Parisians had famously used carrier pigeons to transport microfilm messages into the city. By the late 1930s, the photographic reduction of documents to very small formats was well understood in scientific and archival circles. The second stream was the wartime imperative, the sheer, pressing, life-or-death urgency that forces innovation at speeds no peacetime laboratory can match. The development of the operational microdot system used by British intelligence is most closely associated with the work carried out under the auspices of Amwine 6's technical section, with significant contributions from scientists working within the wider framework of wartime government research. The precise institutional home of this work remains partly obscured by classification that was not fully lifted until decades after the war. What is documented is the basic principle, which is simultaneously simple and staggering. A full typewritten page, the kind you might produce on a standard office typewriter, roughly 250 words of dense intelligence text, was first photographed using a standard large-format camera. The negative was then subjected to a series of successive reduction exposures using a specially adapted optical bench. The critical component was the lens system, a compound microscope objective, repurposed and inverted, that could reduce the image on each successive pass without introducing the distortions or blurrings that would render the final document unreadable. At each stage, the image shrank while retaining its clarity. After several reductions, the original full page of text had been compressed onto a piece of film roughly 1 millimeter in diameter, approximately the size of a typed full stop or the period at the end of a printed sentence. The resulting microdot was not an approximation or a summary. It was a perfect, complete photographic reproduction of the original document, readable in its entirety when examined under a microscope with a magnification of roughly 200 times. The dot itself was cut from the film using a sharpened needle or a fine punch and transferred, with a drop of the same adhesive used in the printing industry, onto the surface of an innocent piece of printed material, a newspaper, a magazine, a personal letter, the full stop at the end of a sentence, the dot above a printed letter I, the tiny mark that terminates an address. The manufacturing process required a darkroom, a precisely calibrated optical bench, steady hands, and enormous patience. But it required no exotic raw materials. The chemicals used were standard photographic developers and fixers. The optical components, while requiring precision grinding and alignment, were derived from existing microscope technology. In a well-equipped laboratory, and by 1941 the relevant British facilities were very well equipped indeed, a single trained technician could produce dozens of microdots in a working day. If you are finding this story as remarkable as the people who invented it clearly did, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational use of microdots by British intelligence networks followed the same logic that had guided the technology's development. Put the information somewhere so obvious that no one thinks to look. A letter from a Dutch merchant to his cousin in Lisbon. A postcard from a French student to her family in Lyon, routed via Switzerland. A book sent from a second-hand dealer in Geneva to a collector in Madrid. These were the kinds of innocent-seeming communications that crossed neutral country borders in their hundreds of thousands, and German censors, however diligent, could not examine everyone with microscopic precision. The procedure for the agent receiving a microdot communication was standardized and rehearsed before deployment. At a pre-agreed location in an ordinary piece of correspondence, the third full stop on the second line of the address, for instance, or the period following a specific word, the agent would locate the dot with a fine needle, lift it, and place it on a microscope slide. Using a field microscope no larger than a fountain pen case, or by arrangement with a trusted local contact who possessed laboratory equipment, the contents could be read in full. The psychological impact on Germain Counterintelligence was, by all accounts, deeply unsettling. The Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst were organizations built on the premise that secrets have hiding places, that a trained searcher, given enough time and the right equipment, can find anything. The microdot undermined that premise completely. It did not hide in a hollow heel or a false-bottomed box. It sat on the surface of a letter, visible to the naked eye as nothing more than a printed mark, and stared back at the searcher with absolute impunity. Records recovered from German counterintelligence archives after the war indicate that by 1943 there was a general awareness within the Abwehr that some form of microphotographic communication was being used by Allied networks, but the precise mechanism, and critically the location protocol used to indicate where the dot was placed, remained unknown to them for the duration of the conflict. Exact numbers of microdots produced and successfully delivered remain classified in part, or have simply been lost to the administrative chaos of wartime. Estimates from post-war intelligence history suggest many hundreds of communications were transmitted this way across occupied Europe between 1941 and 1945. It would be misleading to suggest that the British were operating in a vacuum, or that the concept of the microdot was exclusively their invention. The Germans themselves had developed a functional microdot program, operated through the Abwehr's technical section under the direction of chemist Zapp, a system that American counterintelligence discovered with considerable alarm in 1941, when an FBI double agent named William Siebold helped expose a German spy network operating in the United States. The German system, which the FBI code-named Micropunkt, used a very similar photographic reduction process and was in some respects technically equivalent to British methods. The crucial difference lay not in the technology itself, but in operational security and deployment. The German Abwehr used their microdot system primarily for communications between Germany and agents operating in the Americas, a long, relatively predictable route that American and British counterintelligence could monitor. The British system was deployed across the far more complex multinodal geography of occupied Europe, where the sheer variety of routes, neutral intermediaries, and cover communications made systematic detection vastly more difficult. American intelligence, working through the Office of Strategic Services, adopted and refined British microdot techniques following close wartime cooperation between London and Washington. By 1943, OSS field operatives in Southern Europe and the Far East were using microdot systems that were directly derived from the British model, with modifications reflecting American photographic industry standards. The Soviets, it later emerged, had developed parallel capabilities of their own, though the details of their operational methods remained obscure until partial archival releases in the 1990s. No other Axis power, Italy, Japan, or the smaller satellite states, developed a microphotographic capability that came close to the sophistication of the British or German programs. Japanese intelligence, for all its other technical achievements, relied primarily on coded radio transmission and human couriers, a strategic choice that placed their networks at much greater risk of detection. Assessing the actual historical impact of the microdot program is genuinely difficult, precisely because its success is measured in absences, in the intelligence that did get through, in the agents who were not caught, in the messages that were never intercepted because they were never found. No post-war tribunal charged a network with using microdots. No dramatic moment of discovery anchored the technology in public memory the way the Enigma machine or the Dam Busters raid did. What historians can say with reasonable confidence is this: the microdot system extended the operational life of at least several significant intelligence networks in Western Europe by removing their dependence on radio transmission for the passage of detailed, high-volume intelligence. In the Netherlands, in Belgium, and particularly in France, networks that survived the worst of the Abwehr's sweeps in 1943 and 1944 were able to do so partly because their most sensitive communications never passed through a radio set. The intelligence they gathered about German coastal defenses, divisional dispositions, and infrastructure targets fed directly into the planning for Operation Overlord. The psychological legacy may have been equally significant. The knowledge within British intelligence circles that an undetectable communication channel existed gave field commanders and network directors a confidence that influenced how aggressively they were willing to task their agents. Risk calculations shifted when the channel for extracting intelligence was, for all practical purposes, invisible. The technology did not die with the war. Microdot systems were adopted, adapted, and used throughout the Cold War by intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Surviving examples of wartime microdot equipment, the optical benches, the modified microscope objectives, the needle-tipped punches used to cut and transfer the dots, can be seen today at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and at the Imperial War Museum in London, where they sit in glass cases looking, to the uninitiated, like nothing more interesting than laboratory apparatus. A few early microdot exemplars, mounted on their original carrier documents, are preserved in the collection of the National Archives at Kew. Return, if you will, to that rain-slicked Paris pavement in the autumn of 1942. Noor Inayat Khan is crossing the street, handbag over her arm, moving briskly in the direction of a safe house she does not know has already been compromised. The world she moves through is one of extraordinary danger, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary ingenuity. The Germans who are watching her are not fools. They are professionals, operating a counterintelligence apparatus of formidable capability, and they will, in the end, find her. But there are things they will not find. Letters that pass through their censorship stations without raising the slightest alarm. Pages of intelligence that cross their checkpoints hidden in the full stops of ordinary correspondence, indistinguishable from the marks left by any typewriter or printing press. An entire operational communications channel that existed for the purposes of their detection apparatus, not as a secret, but as nothing at all. This is what the microdot achieved that no code, no cipher, and no hollow-heeled shoe ever could. A code can be broken, given enough time and enough mathematics. A cipher can be cracked if the traffic volume is sufficient. A hidden compartment can be found by a thorough enough searcher. But you cannot find something that does not present itself as hidden. You cannot crack a secret that does not announce itself as a secret. The microdot sat in plain sight, wearing the costume of insignificance. A full stop, a printed mark, a dot of ink on the surface of an innocent letter. And it passed through the most rigorous counterintelligence apparatus of the 20th century without detection, not because it was clever enough to fool the Germans, but because it was clever enough to never be noticed by them at all. Hundreds of messages, scores of networks, thousands of words of intelligence that reached London and shaped the Allied war effort, compressed into specks of film so small you could fit a dozen of them onto the tip of a pin. The whole enterprise rested on a single audacious principle that ran against every instinct of the professional spy. The best place to hide something is not somewhere secret. It is somewhere obvious. It is in the full stop at the end of an ordinary sentence, in the printed mark at the close of a line, in the nothing at all that terminates a word. The Germans searched. They searched methodically, professionally, and often brilliantly. They searched coats and shoes and suitcases and books and hollow sticks and false-bottom tins. They searched almost everything. They just never thought to search the full stops.